Our sponsor today is GLSA. For those non-members who may be dropping in on the call today, welcome. And GLSA is Group Legal Services Association. It's an affiliate of the American Bar Association. It's a professional membership group representing the legal services plan industry and provider attorneys. And joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. And check it out at glsaonline.org. My name is Tom Martin. I'll be your host today. Our teleconference today is The Promise and Peril of Blockchain and ICOs with Amy Wan. So I'm very excited to introduce you to today's guest, Amy Wan, who is a California lawyer and the founder and chief legal hacker at Bootstrap Legal. She's previously a partner at Crowdfunding Lawyers. She's general counsel at Patch of Land, named to the ABA's top 10 women to watch in legal tech, co-founder of Legal Hackers Los Angeles Meetup Group. She studied at the London School of Economics and the University of Southern California. I'm just exhausted reading all of that, Amy. If you could tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Yeah, sure. So I basically look at the intersection of law and technology, wherever it happens to be interesting, right? And so for the past couple of years, I've been very involved in the crowdfunding industry, and that obviously involves a lot of securities law. Securities, for those who don't quite know what it is, it's basically capital markets, or, it's basically the law around raising capital, right? And that's really relevant to today's topic because basically in the past year, this thing called ICOs have really taken off. ICOs, for those who don't know, are initial coin offerings and token sales, and really it's actually just a subset of crowdfunding. I think a lot of people don't quite understand that. They think it's something super brilliant, super new, and crowdfunding is not even that new as well. Crowdfunding is really just online group investment. But yeah, so I run Bootstrap Legal. We are a legal technology company, and we are actually putting out a new product right now in the blockchain space. I think this might be specifically interesting to attorneys because the space that we're specifically looking at is in smart contracts. Smart contracts are basically, for every lawyer who writes traditional English contracts, smart contracts are like that, except they're done in code. And the other interesting aspect of them is, because they're often written in if-then rules, right? They are basically self-executing and they're immutable. But what we found is, despite all the rhetoric that's out there that smart contracts are going to put lawyers out of jobs and, that sort of stuff, contracts are actually incredibly vulnerable. And, we found this niche, and I'm happy to, talk about later what we plan to do in it.
That sounds fantastic, and I'm just so happy to have you here today because obviously you know the space, you know what you're talking about, and that's kind of the opposite of me when it comes to blockchain and ICO. So I guess I'm the perfect person to be asking you questions so I can learn myself. But first, let's start out with you know I just want to get to know you a little bit first, and have the attendees that are listening in learn a little bit more about you and what got you motivated. Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I actually grew up in Southern California in a little tiny suburb called Hacienda Heights. Just very, I, I guess to me it was a pretty normal community. Um, went to undergrad at USC. I actually started college as a pre-med major mostly because my parents made me. But I think through college I found my way and actually discovered that, the thing I really care about is community building, it's social justice, it's, access to justice. And so that's really why I went to law school. I mean, I can get into the longer story of during college I went and did an internship at a hospital in Ghana, and Despite working in the hospital, that was like the summer where uh, the healthcare workers in Ghana are actually employed by the government. They're paid by the government, and so they all went on strike because the government basically wasn't paying them their salary. Um, that entire experience made me realize that grief can heal people's souls and doctors can heal people's bodies, but lawyers, I think, have the potential to help people with the situations that they find themselves in, and that's really why I went to law school.
That's a great story, Amy. I remember that we met for the first time. I think it was about 4 years ago. You were starting up the Legal Hackers meetup in LA then, right?
Yeah, it's been a couple years now.
Yeah, and Legal Hackers as its mission, it has as its mission to improve access to justice. That's one of the things, right?
Yeah, I mean, our scope is pretty broad. It's very educational. You're basically bringing together the law and technology communities, but one of the end goals is to promote access to justice, hopefully through the use of technology.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that now. So you got drawn to the law to help people, and so now there's this innovation now where it seems almost every day we're hearing about how things are changing in the law. How technology is being applied to the law, and lately there's, at least to me, seems to be this white hot interest when it comes to um, blockchain, um, ICOs, and then what is the law with regard to that. But before we get into whether or not it should be regulated or how it is to be regulated, I mean, let's start with the basics. What what is a token?
So that's an interesting question, and I think to properly answer it, I think one has to distinguish between a token and a coin, right? So I think a lot of people by this point have heard of cryptocurrency, and those are what I consider coins. They might increase in value, but they're almost like digital gold. And the most popular ones, of course, start with Bitcoin. Now we've got Litecoin and Ethereum. Uh, and those are really they're almost more so like methods of payment, right? Whereas tokens, I think, are something a little bit different. So tokens can honestly they can really be anything.
Mhm.
I've seen tokens that represent interest in funds. There are tokens, we call them utility tokens, that provide some sort of credit for a product or a service. And then of course there are tokens that do a whole wide range of other things. You can have tokens that basically represent a membership interest in a network, or some sort of buy into some sort of decentralized network. So right now tokens can be anything, but I think the best way for attorneys to think about them is don't think so much about the technology. Think about what is the function of the token, right? Because every token really actually kind of does something different, and it's really up to the imagination of the founders. I think maybe in a couple years, we'll start to see more categories of tokens, right? And so we don't have to sit here rubbing our foreheads all confused about like, well, what does this token do? What does that token do? There's going to be utility tokens. There's going to be membership tokens. There's going to be equity tokens. And equity tokens, once upon a time we had paper stock certificates. Now we have like digital stock certificates or e-stock certificates, right? A
Mhm.
token is basically the next iteration of that. It's basically um, it's equity in a company, but in the form of a digital token.
Okay, so Bitcoin, Litecoin, all of those are kind of holders of value, and then a token is one where there's a, I mean, it kind of embodies a relationship with a particular company.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good way to describe it. I mean, all of them really may or may not have some sort of value, and I think we're going to continue to see that shake out more over the next couple of months and years. But
Hmm.
really, when I think of Bitcoin and Ethereum, I think that the way you are bringing them into the world, right, is that you're mining them. You literally have these huge farms, computer servers. Most of them are in China, actually, that use incredible computing power, and they solve these algorithms to bring them into the world. That's not necessarily the case with tokens. With tokens, you might be able to buy them. You might mine them, but in a way where you're providing some sort of service, right? So, for example, Filecoin was a recent large ICO, and their miners don't solve computer algorithms; they provide data
Hmm.
storage space, right? So,
So each
I see
token can have a
coins
different way of creating the value.
exactly, and
I see.
each token can have multiple ways of coming into the world.
Wow, I could see how this gets extremely complicated. Um, well, okay, well, the next building block is in this world is blockchain. So if you could explain what that is a little bit and how that fits into tokens and Bitcoin.
Yeah, so blockchain is it's a funny thing. It is the underlying technology that actually powers all of this space. So when you hear about blockchain startups, they're not necessarily ICOs, they're not necessarily tokens or coins, right? They, for example, some of the large financial service institutions right now are looking at into using blockchain to power what they do, but they're not necessarily going out and doing an ICO. So blockchain is the underlying technology that powers all of this. What blockchain really is, and the funny thing is, there's all these people out there who purport to be blockchain experts and this and that. I think it's actually really hard to find anyone who can give a really good explanation of what blockchain is and what its values and its limitations are. And I'm not going to pretend to be one of those people, but at the highest level, it is basically a distributed ledger. You can almost think of it as a database, but with a lot more features and a lot more power, right? This is probably the non-kosher way of saying this, but it's basically a database on steroids. And that database traditionally has been stored on a lot of networks, right? And so
Hmm.
the entire uh, crypto community right now, one of their central tenets, one of their main philosophies, is the philosophy of decentralization. So what that really means is, we're not dealing with any central party, any central government, any central company, right? We are really counting on the community to build and create our community. Um, and where blockchain comes into that is because everything is stored on this distributed ledger and everyone kind of almost owns a copy of that ledger, you can't go and fake a what do you call it? An entry on the ledger because for example, you can't go, it's immutable. You can't go back and change the ledger. You can't amend it. You can't modify it. It is what it is, and it's set in stone, and it's meant to do that to protect a number of different things, but one of them is fraud, right? And so,
Yeah.
unfortunately, the downside of this technology that some people right now are trying to solve is that because it takes up so much storage space on so many people's servers and computers, the unfortunate side effect is that it takes up a lot of computing power, and that's one of the big issues that a lot of the larger blockchains or more widely used blockchains are trying to grapple with right now.
I think one analogy um, that I thought of for blockchain that is probably definitely aging me, but it it's as if like in a real small town. you know, if something happened, it probably happened in front of almost everyone. Like, like if there was some transaction, um, like if we were to assume that everyone actually witnessed this transaction happen, then all of those people would be holders of the truth of that transaction, and it would be distributed amongst the people that they knew this to be true. And to me, it seems like blockchain is kind of a digitization of that. Of course, it's much more sophisticated and widespread, but the idea, from what you explained, it sounds like there's a transaction, and then basically you have all of these like virtual witnesses to this transaction that are noting it to be true. Is that
That's a
close?
good way of putting it. That's basically what it is.
Okay. So okay, so we have Bitcoin, we have and others like it. We have tokens that individual companies are issuing. We have blockchain, and then cryptocurrency. Is that like what Bitcoin is and Litecoin, or does it mean something else?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, cryptocurrency, I think now is maybe a slightly older term. It's what we were calling these things back in like, I don't know, 2012, 2013, when we were trying to give it a formal definition. So people were calling them cryptocurrency or virtual currency, right? But essentially, it's kind of all the same thing.
Okay. And then the ICO, initial coin offering. Um, it, before I ask you that, is a coin a token, or is a coin different than a token?
I think this is basically where you start getting really deep into semantics, and I think a lot of different people have different opinions, right? At least to me, and this is just my humble opinion, um, I see a coin as it has some sort of value. It's almost like a currency, right? Whereas I see a token as a digital form of value of something else, something not a currency. But that's not an exact definition, and I'll probably leave it to the crypto community to tear that definition apart.
Sounds good enough. Okay, so an ICO stands for initial coin offering, and they're like all the rage right now. So what is that about? What is an ICO?
Sure. So I think to really properly, explore what an ICO is, you have to go back about a year. There was there is a protocol called Ethereum. It's a very popular one. And last year when Ethereum was still very young, its value was actually still relatively low. These founders decided to run basically a social experiment, and it was basically a decentralized fund. They called it the DAO, or the Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And it basically was exactly what it sounds like, right? They basically said, hey, everybody who holds Ethereum, put some Ether into this fund, and we're all going to decide what projects should be funded. And on top of that, they made basically a social compact on a smart contract, and they said, okay, here's the smart contract, here are the rules that our entire community agrees to, and code is law, right? Because everything in a smart contract is in code. Well, that is probably what you can consider to be one of the first ICOs. Unfortunately, the DAO did not last. What happened was that someone who bought into this network, a hacker,
Yeah.
found a vulnerability in the smart contract, and even though they didn't technically break, they didn't violate any terms of the contract.
Mhm.
For all intents and purposes, you can say that they violated the spirit or the intent of the contract. What they did was they executed an action on the smart contract that basically repeated itself over and over again simultaneously many times, and they were basically able to run off with 50 to 60 million dollars worth of Ethereums. And
Wow.
basically after that happened, a lot of not very good things ensued, and you
And this was
know,
with the very
um,
first ICO.
yeah, you could probably consider the DAO one of the first ICOs, although people were predicting the rise of ICOs as far as, like I saw one blog where Naval from AngelList was predicting them maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
Mhm.
But that was probably the first one, and basically after that, a
Yeah.
lot of people saw it. They didn't necessarily, take all the lessons from what happened, and people started looking at this as, wow, this is a new way to raise money for my project. Now, I hear a lot of criticism of ICOs in, uh, out on Reddit and the interwebs and whatever, and for good reason, right? It is a very hyped up space right now, but at the time, there were very few to almost no investors who would be willing to fund a decentralized project. Um, and I want to harp on decentralization for a second because I think it's a very important concept here. If one open sources their code, they put it out there for everyone to see, and also everyone to pick at.
Right.
You really have no intellectual property, and your company basically its value is in its execution. And so, with the concept of decentralization and open sourcing your code, it was very difficult to find any investors willing to invest in that. I think one of the earliest VCs that did was Andreessen Horowitz, but aside from them, like even if you go to Silicon Valley today, a lot of them, you know, there are a lot of VCs who don't want to invest anything in crypto, don't want anything to do with the space, don't understand the space, can't really justify to their investors investing in a decentralized open source project, right? And so suddenly this became a very appealing way for all these people with all these decentralized project ideas to go and fund their decentralized projects. So basically, after the DAO and after people realize, hey, this might be a good way to fund decentralized projects, then we start getting this proliferation of ICOs, and then you have basically what you see now. And the way I would describe the space now, and maybe this makes me sound a little bit cynical, is that, for a while, especially probably over the spring and summer, people were saying, hey, wow, this is awesome. It's this brand new way of raising money, and it's unregulated, which was actually untrue.
Right.
And I think today it's kind of gone a little bit overboard, although I think we are seeing a slight correction in the space today. But now you've got all these startups who maybe they couldn't raise money previously, or they failed at raising money or whatever, but now they're all trying to take their whatever startup concept and back it onto the blockchain so that they can do an ICO purely to raise money. So that I think is problematic. I think there are a lot of ICOs happening today that quite frankly should not ICO. But, that's my personal opinion, but I think a lot of people also agree with me.
Yeah. I mean, right now there's all of these ICOs that it sounds like everyone's banging on the door with a white paper trying to get um, I guess the credibility that they need with associated experts so that they can launch an ICO. So what is this about? Like the mechanics of that? Like, why do people need a white paper? Who are they trying to get to help them? Like, what is this process that's going on right now?
That's funny. So one doesn't actually need a white paper. The reason why um, white papers exist is because if you go back to the very, very beginning, right,
Hmm.
when Satoshi Nakamoto, the anonymous Bitcoin founder, introduced Bitcoin into the world, uh, described what Bitcoin was all about. Um, and many folks who have followed in the footsteps in the crypto community over the past several years, every time they put out a project, they also put out a white paper. I think now we've
Hmm.
gotten kind of to the white paper extreme. I mean, there is a reason why VCs ask for pitch decks and not white papers, right? Because no one wants to sit there reading white papers all day long. They would rather, quickly glance through a very short visual pitch deck to get the gist. And I've been flying up and down from the Silicon Valley the past couple months, and the stuff I hear about white papers is a lot of it is nonsense, right? There are literally developers walking around saying, "Oh, make your white paper as long as possible. Put a lot of graphics in it. Put a lot of algorithms in it to make it sound as not understandable as possible. Make it sound like it's really complex and you're really smart. So maybe they won't get it and they
Right.
think you're a lot smarter and they'll invest in you." So
Right. So
that's
they'll
what I'm
just
starting to
nod
see
and hand
happen
you the
right
money.
now. Yeah, and that's unfortunate. The legal community is also guilty of overwriting and writing things in a way that is overly complex. It's very hard for lay people to understand, and I think now the crypto community might be guilty of that as well. I don't think white papers should be too long, right? And I also think that they should be written to explain to a non-technical audience exactly what they're doing. So that's my personal opinion, but hey, it's just me.
Well, okay, so we've talked about these building blocks of what's going on, and you'd mentioned smart contracts, and how does that fit into this as well?
So smart contracts are a very interesting concept. They are basically, like I said earlier, um, you know, they're basically in agreement with an execution mechanism, right? And that execution mechanism is written code. Now, one of the more popular smart contract platforms out there today is built on Ethereum. They are called Solidity smart contracts. But basically, smart contracts, is an offer, an acceptance. Hopefully, there is usually consideration. Um, the mind-bending part here is that when you enter into a smart contract, you might not even know who you're contracting with. A lot of this is done pseudonymously, so that obviously presents some interesting logistical issues in the twist. Um, but when my co-founder and I were looking at smart contracts, we basically realized, hey, there's a lot of vulnerabilities here, right? As we were monitoring what was happening with the DAO, which lost, $50, $60 million, and then
Right.
the first Parity wallet hack, which is a multi-signature wallet, which is written on a smart contract. I think that lost I don't know, maybe $30 million the first time around. And then more recently, Parity Wallet got hacked again through an accidental code deletion. And now, $300 million worth of Ethereum is locked up, and they aren't quite sure how they're going to fix that. To me and my co-founder, this presented a huge problem, right? The best lawyer
Yeah,
in the world
I would
cannot
say so.
sit there. The best lawyer in the world can't sit there and promise you that they're going to write a perfect disputeless traditional contract. And I don't think that the best coder in the world can sit there and promise you that they can write perfect, errorless, disputeless smart contracts. Smart contracts have their place where they become very useful. I think they're mostly useful for small financial microtransactions. Um, But that's not what developers are doing today. I mean, there's literally a developer out there I've seen who is taking Series A financing documents and putting them into a smart contract, which I think raises all sorts of red flags, right? Because there's a concept called wet code and dry code. Dry code is basically objective triggers, right? Like once, I don't know, Bitcoin reaches 10,000, sell, half of my portfolio. And then there's wet code, which might be more subjective, right? And this is where we get into the legal realm. People might put into their contract, reasonable, or words like substantial, things that do not have an objective trigger. And so that
Right.
leaves things open for interpretation. So in terms of smart contracts, you've got a lot of things going on here. You've got possible coding errors. You've got vulnerabilities. So for example, hacks against the spirit of a contract, like I mentioned earlier, or the intent of a contract. And then, of course, as we've seen with, maybe the past 10, 20 years of LegalZoom or, regular templated documents, people might pull a template smart contract off the shelf without really actually understanding or knowing what it says. And then, of course, human beings are infinitely creative. They will find a way to do whatever they want, and at the same time, situations change and people need flexibility. So at the end of the day, I truly believe that people still want and need to amend, modify, or terminate their smart contracts. So given all of these unresolved issues, what we're doing today is we are basically building a legal layer on top of the entire crypto space. So what that means is we're building an SDK. You can think of it as one line of code, almost analogous to an arbitration clause, for example, that you would put in a traditional English contract. You put that one line of code into your smart contract, and to the extent a dispute ever arises or something's going wrong, you can trigger that one line of code. It freezes execution of a smart contract because remember, these are self-executing mechanisms. The entire thing gets kicked over to a dispute resolution marketplace because I don't believe that dispute resolution is a one-size-fits-all thing. And then for a lot of logistical and cultural reasons, the entire thing sits on top of a borderless digital jurisdiction because even if you are able to get across a lot of the logistical hurdles, like actually knowing who the other contracting party is, because if you don't know, you can't serve a complaint to the opposing party. You can't really even sue them in court. Even if you can get across those logistical hurdles, have fun talking to your counsel, a judge, and a jury, all of whom think that anything Bitcoin related is inherently illegal and fraudulent. Have fun explaining your smart contract to them. Oh, by the way, they can't read it because it's in code, so you'll have to call an expert witness to interpret what the smart contract says because less than 1% of the population can actually read code. So
Right.
essentially what we're trying to create is a friendly, private jurisdiction for the crypto community, by the crypto community, for them to be able to resolve disputes, because I believe that smart contract adoption cannot take off unless and until you achieve transactional confidence. Because otherwise, every time you enter into one of these smart contracts, it's essentially like you're playing roulette, right? You don't know what the outcome is that you're going to get.
Well, it sounds to me like it's definitely needed and makes a whole lot of sense. Basically, you have this contract running on automatic pilot, and at least for now, it's bound to get into some accidents. So why not have some human intervention there to help out when needed. It's only on the basis of when there's some wall that they come to where you need to jump in and help out, right?
Yeah, and really the first most fundamental issue here is really just identifying the problem, right? So for example, over the summer, my social media feeds were full of headlines where someone would go out, they would ICO. A lot of these ICOs are actually powered by smart contracts, right? And in the first 15, 20 minutes of their ICO, a lot of them would get hacked for $2 or $3 million. And they would have to sit there and they would shrug their shoulders and be like, oops, oh well, like there's nothing we can really do about it. And that doesn't work. That doesn't happen in the real world, right? You can't just sit there and be like, oh, sorry guys, I lost $2 million of the money you gave me. In the real world, that ends up in lawsuits.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Right? So the first part of this, which we're actually pre-selling right now and we're launching in early January, is a smart contract notification system. And that basically allows for smart contract users to be able to even monitor what is going on with their smart contract, because it's actually not easy to do that today. So basically the same way that banks, credit cards, and credit reporting companies might text or email you about unusual activity on your account, we will text or email a smart contract user and let them know about what's happening on their smart contract, i.e., if someone is draining funds from their smart contract. So at least they have a chance to run to their computer and stop it before the hacker gets too far.
Right. All right. Well, we've covered definitely a lot of ground here. And I know that the people that are listening in and that will be listening in to the recorded version of this in the future would definitely like to know what resources they could turn to learn more about this and get further in-depth knowledge about blockchain, ICOs, smart contracts. What are some good recommendations for them?
Yeah, so there's a lot to read. It really depends on what area they want to learn more about. There's
Mhm.
a lot of great blogs out there. For example, I blog on Crowdfund Insider. There's also Cointelegraph. If they want to monitor and see what kind of ICOs are coming out, there's ICOalerts.com. If they want to dig into the legal issues, I actually tend to put out a lot of like mini updates on the space on my LinkedIn, so they can just follow me on LinkedIn. But yeah, right now, if you go out and read about this stuff, there's a lot of resources and information out there, but I'll also warn people that there's also a lot of bad resources and information. Like there's literally still big parts of the crypto community that think that ICOs are unregulated, and that's just not true.
Yeah, and that thank you for bringing that up because that's one question I want to get in before we close is the issue of regulation. I know you and I had talked kind of offline about this before, which is what it seems to be this idea that, oh, well, this is based on some technology, so therefore it's not like stock or it's not a security. So the question of whether or not a token is a security is still unresolved, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's not unresolved actually. So on July 27th of this year, the SEC released a report that they did, basically saying that the DAO and ICOs, um, probably are securities and are regulated by all the same securities laws that traditional fundraising campaigns have been regulated by, right? Now, there is a possibility that an ICO or a token sale isn't a security. That's entirely possible. It's just that most of what I've seen, and even the new SEC chair has said this, most of what he's seen, he actually had a quote a couple weeks ago where he said, I haven't seen one that isn't a security. And it's not that it can't not be a security, it's just that people are being greedy and they're not structuring their ICO in a way that's not a security. That's the problem right now. But in the US, to the extent an ICO is collecting money from US investors, it is regulated by securities law. If they're raising money from others outside of the United States, they are governed by the local laws and regulations of whatever jurisdiction they're raising money in. And every jurisdiction right now feels differently about ICOs.
Hmm. I do have one quick question from one of our listeners, Blake. He's asking, do you know of any examples of ICOs that are truly based on a utility token, like it being a
Ooh.
utility?
I feel like I've seen one or two. And I know some of my security attorney friends might have seen one in all of, the pitches and calls that they get. The vast majority of these, I would say 99% of them,
Hmm.
you know, to the extent that they sell to U.S. investors, under U.S. laws at least, would be considered securities. And you have to remember, we're not just dealing with federal securities laws here, we're dealing with state securities laws. So even if under federal securities laws it might not be a security, it might still be a security to a state regulator, right? Because the state regulators may have different tests. And, personally, I would choose to be regulated by federal securities law over state securities laws any day. Federal preemption is a wonderful thing. So,
Yes.
yeah, but I would, prefer not to name the ones that I have seen that I think more popularly do not represent securities. And I know, in the early days, in late spring and summer, people were writing opinion letters on this, and now most of the respectable securities attorneys I talk to, they won't even talk to you, or they won't even talk to an ICO issuer anymore unless the issuer concedes that it is a security. I think people are really scared for their malpractice insurance risk. They've seen and heard what the FEC is saying on this point, and ICO issuers are a very interesting breed of clients. They will actually sit there and argue with you for hours over how not to make it a security. I know of some that have been opinion letter shopping, right? And so I think that's why securities attorneys are now taking an increasingly hard stance on the space.
Well, I think we could close on that. I mean, it's an interesting time. There's a lot of activity, and I just want to thank you, Amy, for spending a little bit of your morning with us. I loved getting to know you better, learning more about blockchain, ICOs, and smart contracts, and it's actually really exciting me to get into it more and figure out, um, you know, what it is exactly and how I might get some advantage from that. Um, so let me ask you that question that I have, the one that doesn't fit with the whole um, discussion here, but one question I always ask guests on the podcast are, what's a place on your bucket list that you've never visited that you would like to, and why?
So I've actually traveled the world a lot, but one of the places I've never actually been to is Greece. I've always
Hmm.
wanted to go. I've never quite made it. But every time I look at the pictures, I'm like, oh man, like that is the vacation I need. It's just so far away, right? Um, but next chance I get to take a longer vacation, that's where I'd like to go.
Well, I hear it's beautiful. I haven't been there either myself, and yeah, one of the reasons I ask is maybe it helps motivate my guests to go there, because if you've wanted to go, I'm sure it'll be a delightful experience. So,
Definitely.
Amy, yeah, I just want to thank you again for sharing your time and thoughts. How can people that are listening in keep in touch with you?
Sure. So they can definitely follow me on LinkedIn. It's Amy Y. Wan. If they do try to connect with me, I get a lot of spam nowadays on LinkedIn, so please actually write a note. And I'm also on all, social media, so Facebook, all of that sort of stuff. And then my company, Bootstrap Legal, we're also on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff. So they can find me there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Amy, for being my guest today. Thank you all for attending our teleconference, The Promise and Peril of Blockchain and ICOs with Amy Wan. Again, my name is Tom Martin. I want to thank GLSA for sponsoring. Remember, joining GLSA is just a good way for solos and small firms to increase their business. Thanks again, Amy.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, I'll see you all next month. Bye.